Okay, so our next topic is going to be continuing with ecology and looking at energy pyramids and various relationships amongst organisms within populations, communities, and ecosystems. So first we're going to start by talking about food chains. So a food chain is a model used to illustrate the flow of energy through an ecosystem by showing who eats who in a relationship. So, in a food chain, each organism represents a different trophic level. And that word, it comes from Greek. It has Greek roots, and it just means food or nourishment. So a different food level or level of eating within a food chain. So a food chain is simply who eats who within a community or ecosystem. So if we're looking at the organism here, this is a phytoplankton. The phytoplankton gives its energy to the krill. And what that means is the thing that's eating has the arrow pointing to it. So the krill eats the phytoplankton, and therefore the energy in the phytoplankton goes to the krill. Same thing, the whale is going to eat the krill. So the krill's energy goes into the whale. So when you're drawing your arrows is always going to point toward the thing that's doing the eating. So that is a food chain. It's a linear one sequence of who eats who, whereas a food web is going to show many different food chains. So a food web is many food chains. And it's going to look like we see over here a network of who eats who instead of just one sequence. So one sequence would be just the phytoplankton to the krill to the whale. The food web would be the whole network of who eats who instead of just that one chain. So a food web is more complex and shows all the various different feeding relationships within an ecosystem. And then we can take these food webs and food chains and put them into what we call an ecological pyramid. So a ecological pyramid, there are different types we're going to talk about, but they just show more in depth of the interactions within one ecosystem, and it gives you a bit more information. So the first one we're going to talk about are pyramids of energy. And energy pyramids are going to show the amount of energy available at each trophic level. And this, the energy pyramid, is going to describe why energy decreases as you go up, and it's going to explain why our food chains are only about 5 or 6 organisms long. So typical food chains are no more than 5 or 6 organisms big. And that's because energy eventually is going to run out. So this is going to limit the number of trophic levels. So in an energy pyramid, the amount of energy rapidly decreases as you move up the pyramid. So only 10% of the energy is transferred from one level to the next. The rest is going to be lost as heat. So if we had our energy pyramid here, I'm going to draw it out for you. There's 100% energy at the very bottom with our producers, which are organisms like grass. Only 10% is passed on from the grass to the grasshopper. Of that 10%, only 10% is passed on to the chicken. And then of that 1%, only 10%, just 0.1%, is passed on to, I don't know, the fox that eats the chicken. So we go from 100, I'll write it on the outside. We go from 100% to 10% to 1% to 0.1%. And if we were to keep going, this number is going to get closer and closer and closer to zero. Meaning, virtually, if you got really, really high up here, an organism wouldn't be able to get that much energy from eating other things. So it makes it impossible for that level to exist. Energy can't be zero. So that is why our food chains are typically not much bigger than 5 organisms long. So this is pretty much the same thing here that I filled it at the bottom. Let's see if I can fit it. So we have our primary producer, which is our autotrophs like grass, and they have 100% energy. And they get their energy from the sun. So the sun's energy goes into our producers, which is our grass. And then we have our primary consumers. And they have 10% energy because they only get the 10% from the 100. Then we have our secondary consumers, which eat our primary consumers, and they only have 1% energy because 10% of 10 is 1. Then we have our tertiary, which is our third consumer. They only have 0.1% energy. Tertiary consumers, again, eat secondary consumers. And at the top, we have our quaternary consumer, which eats the tertiary consumer, and they are going to have 0.01% of energy. All this extra that's lost is released as heat. So it's used up by the organism, it's released as heat. And then on the outside here, we have decomposers, working to break down the remains of these organisms once they are dead. So we're going to move into our second type of pyramid now, which is a pyramid of numbers. Pyramid of numbers simply shows the number of organisms at each level. So it's going to tell you how many, this one over here has how many snails and how many frogs and how many foxes. It tells you exactly how many, the number of organisms at each level. So we have our typical food chain. Now we're going to know how many organisms we have at each step. And I just want to point out that sometimes our pyramids here can be upside down, so they can have weird shapes. And oftentimes you see these odd shapes if you have, say, one very, very large producer, like a huge tree. So if you have a huge tree and then you have tons of birds living in that tree, And on the birds, you have lots of parasites living on each bird. It's going to mean that you have more birds than you have trees, and you have more parasites than you have birds. So it's going to make the pyramid turn upside down, and that's okay. Sometimes they do have weird shapes, and that's totally fine. Another thing that you'll note, if you see a pyramid of number, it's only going to have a number. It's not going to have any units. So if we flip back up here to our energy pyramid, it showed percent. It's always going to have percent for percent energy, or it'll have something like joules, which can be used to represent energy. Our next pyramid is going to have grams or kilograms, but numbers, it's simply going to have a tree with a number 1, or a bird with the number 7. It's not going to have any units. So here, how can a pyramid of numbers have a smaller bottom and a larger top? And that's going to be, I'm just going to simplify. Let's say you have one large producer and many things feed on it. Feed on it. So if I were to, over here in the margins, draw my upside down pyramid, let's say down here I have one tree, then I have 20 birds, and let's say each bird has 2 parasites, which is, underestimated. Then my numbers are going to go up instead of down. So therefore it would be an upside down pyramid from what we would traditionally see. The third type of pyramid we're going to discuss is a pyramid of biomass. Remember, bio means life. Mass is a measurement of weight. So this is going to show the amount of living tissue there is in a particular habitat. So if you guys wanted to do it like this, living tissue there is in a particular habitat. So if I had, let's just say we're working with the same pyramid just because it's right here for me, I would say my one tree weighs 2,000 pounds or 2,000 kilograms. So this is going to be representing weight of all the organisms added up. So if I had 12 birds, the pyramid of biomass is going to show the weight of those 12 birds added together. So typically, traditionally, biomass pyramids are going to follow the same shape as a pyramid of energy, because energy and mass are related. So energy and mass are going to be related. So for instance, let's say we have a producer with 100% energy. There's going to be a larger mass of that producer because they have more energy than, say, I don't know, something that eats it. So energy and mass are related. Therefore, they're going to have a similar trend. So that's all we're going to talk about for the pyramids. We're going to switch over now to some relationships amongst organisms and how 2 organisms may interact with each other. The first thing that we're going to talk about is competition. Competition is when 2 individuals, or even more than 2, sometimes it's a whole group of individuals, fighting for the same resource, and all individuals are harmed when they compete. So both are harmed, because if you're competing for something, you both have a risk of getting hurt. So both are inevitably harmed, and we're going to represent that using the minus minus symbol. And there are two types of competition we're going to talk about. We have intra-specific, which is competition amongst the same species. So if we flip over here and we see, I can't tell if, let's just say they're deer. These two deer, let's say they're fighting for a mate. They both want the same female deer. They want a mate. Now they're going to fight. And since they're both the same species, it's called intraspecific. Versus interspecific is fighting against another species. So if the squirrel and the bird are both fighting for seeds or nuts, they're different species, therefore it's interspecific competition. So you don't always have to be in competition for a resource with an individual of the same species. There is also predation. Predation is simply one organism eating and consuming another. There is no long-term relationship there. One is just simply the predator, and one is the prey. So this is going to be the predator-prey relationship. Now we're going to talk about, I said up here for predation, I said there's no long-term relationship. Symbiosis is going to be more of a long-term type of situation. So this is going to be longer term relationship amongst different organisms. And we're going to talk about 3 different types of relationships that can happen in symbiosis. So you can have mutualism. That's a U, mutualism. And in mutualism, both organisms benefit. So an example would be, I think this image comes from ants living in a tree. Ants fight off insects from the tree. They fight the insects coming in because they know that the insects are going to damage the tree. So the insects fight to protect the tree. Therefore, the tree gets protection. However, the tree provides sap to feed the ants, so the ants get food. Tree gets protection, ants get food, they both benefit. So we have tree, protected, ants fed, they both get something good. It's supposed to be ants fed. The next type of relationship we have is called commensalism. In commensalism, one organism benefits and one gets nothing. It's not hurt and it's not helped, and we represent that with a +0. One gets something good, one gets nothing at all. An example of that would be a remora. A remora is a little fish that swims next to a shark, and it gets protection And it also gets food. It gets protection because nobody's going to come up and try to mess with it right next to a big shark. And it gets food because it gets the leftover remnants from whatever the shark eats. But the shark gets nothing. It's not helped. It's not harmed. It just has that little fish swimming there next to it. That's commensalism. And the third one is parasitism. In parasitism, one organism benefits, one is harmed. So we represent that with a plus and a minus. One gets something good and one gets something bad. So in this example here, we have a caterpillar. The caterpillar has a parasite. The parasite gets food, it gets protection, it lives in the caterpillar. When eventually the parasites will grow and they'll turn into little larvae, they almost look like maggots, and they'll branch out of this caterpillar. And then the caterpillar will actually, it gets like almost brain control, and it'll start to protect these little maggots as they grow, and they try to turn back into the flies that they should be over time. But when they're still maggots, the caterpillar is under brain control and will actually protect them while they go through metamorphosis, which is kind of cool. But ultimately, the caterpillar dies. And that's why I say this is more of a longer term type of relationship. Even in situations where an organism is going to die, they're still in somewhat of a long-term relationship with their host. So in this situation, the caterpillar does die, yes. However, it is in a relationship with the parasite for a while. The parasite grows inside of it. The maggots are going to hatch. The caterpillar will help them go through metamorphosis before the caterpillar dies. So it's more than just one eats the other. They are together for a while. I do want to mention for parasitism, typically when people think of parasitism, they think of one thing living in or on something else. So parasites would be things like fleas, ticks, tapeworms. But parasitism doesn't always have to take that disgusting type of relationship. There's one example with birds where one bird called the cuckoo will lay its eggs in the nest of another smaller bird. So it'll go into the nest of a little bird called the warbler. It'll lay its eggs in the warbler's nest, and it will take the warbler's eggs and kick them out. So the chicks will die. And the warbler actually raises the cuckoo's babies. So in that situation, the cuckoo gets benefited because it gets to reproduce. Another bird will raise its young. However, the warbler gets harmed because its offspring dies and it's not actually passing on its genes. So just be careful with parasitism. It's not always a disgusting type of living on or in something else. It's not always that blood-sucking or creepy crawly type of relationship. If one organism is benefited and one is harmed, they don't necessarily have to be living on or in each other. So just keep that one in the back of your head. There'll be some practice on Canvas for this. See you next time.